Hello, everyone, and welcome to InnovaHealth Partners Talk Live. I am Tiffany Chenier, Manager of Investor Relations at InnovaHealth Partners, leading growth investors in the medical technology sector. Thank you for joining this conversation with Mike Musallin, Chairman and CEO of Edwards Lifesciences, Dr. Toby Cosgrove, our Senior Advisor and Partner, and Tim Berkowitz, our President and CEO, specifically about the impact that the COVID-19 era is having on Edwards Lifesciences and more broadly on the healthcare industry. Before we get started, let me say a few words about this webinar and provide some background. To budget your time, this conversation will take about 45 minutes. We will provide you with the recording of this webinar after the event. The link to the replay will be available on our LinkedIn page and on our website as well. The audience has been placed on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have any questions, we would be happy to answer them after this webinar. As the world is reshaped by the pandemic, we are very pleased to engage with you here, especially with the unique insight Mr. Mussalin will provide. I will now turn it over to Tim Berkowitz for the main part of this presentation.
Today, Dr. Cosgrove and I are delighted to welcome Edwards Lifesciences Chairman and CEO, Mike Mussallem, who's held those roles for the past 2 decades. Under Mike's leadership, Edwards has revolutionized the treatment of heart disease and critical care monitoring, driving uptake of innovative, minimally invasive interventions such as TAVR, while driving shareholder value and leading the company from its IPO in 2000 to $4 billion in sales and an $80 billion market cap today. The company continues to drive innovation with the primary aim of helping patients as the key part of its credo. Edwards is committed to novel interventions with a focus on minimally invasive technologies, cost effectiveness, and opening new markets. These themes are central to the private companies in which InnovaHealth seeks to invest. So we know you have a long history with Mike and with Edwards. Would you like to say a few words to introduce him properly and kick off our webinar here today?
Well, it's been a great pleasure to know Mike over more than 20 years. I've been with him as we have developed products and some of which actually we improved and brought together to market. And so it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you, Mike, and thank you. You've led an incredible organization that has done a great deal for many, many people all over the world. So, Mike, let's start with you, if we could, with a few questions. Can you tell me a little bit about the history, your personal history, and how you happened to get to Edwards in the first place?
Yeah, thanks, Toby. It's my pleasure to join you both. It really is an honor. And we'll get a chance to talk about our collaboration a little bit. I grew up in the Midwest, was a chemical engineer by education, and joined Baxter as a young engineer 40 years ago. And I had a chance to kind of grow up in Baxter, if you will. It was a sort of, I'll call it a meritocracy, kind of a place where if you got something done, they gave you more to do. And later on, in the late 80s, I had an opportunity to join a company called, one of the businesses called Bentley. Bentley made oxygenators, and I got involved there, and one thing led to another, and I actually fell in love with cardiovascular medicine. I really found it far more personal than many of the ways that, you know, when you make products where you make millions of something per day or per week, patients become invisible. In our world, it's a personal business, and it reminds you of that, and that sort of suited me well. But if you like, I'll tell you a little bit of the story of Edwards and where it came from. Do you want to go there?
Absolutely.
So it's actually an interesting story. It's named after a man by the name of Miles Lowell Edwards, and he really was a hydraulics engineer. And he had lots of patents. He worked in the paper and pulp industry, and he had heart disease in his family. He personally had heart disease, and when he was 60 years old, he thought, you know, and he actually made some money off a patent that he sold to the U.S. government that allowed World War II aircraft to fly at a high altitude. he decided, wouldn't it be great to make an artificial heart using all his hydraulics knowledge? He hooked up with a young surgeon by the name of Albert Starr, and Albert says, hey, we don't even have a heart valve. Let's start with that. And sure enough, they did. They created a little ball check valve that was the first commercially available heart valve, and that was the birth of Edwards Laboratories back in the days. And it was an entrepreneurial company where, you know, people could come and get things done. Yeah, Toby.
So you've got a very special mission, and how's that affect the products and the culture of the organization?
Well, it's everything, and without sounding too idealistic, you can imagine, well, you know, there's lots of ways to earn a living in life, but when you're earning a living by, you know, really having a high impact on patients that need you desperately, talk about purpose, talk about doing something important. So yeah, it might be a nice salary or a nice place to work or nice benefits, but the just knowing that you're doing important things for patients is what motivates our people. It allows us to attract some of the best and brightest and allow them to go and pursue dreams of, you know, how do we do this better than we ever have before? And so it makes for a stimulating environment.
Seems to me like you had a motto about putting patients first.
Yeah, you know what? I thought about it a lot, and somehow when we think about the business of healthcare, often in the past we lost the patient in this vision. You know, we think about, gee, what was economically viable and what made big markets and all that, and when it comes down to it, the ultimate person that benefits or not is the patient. And if there's one thing that you could get all employees, whether it was somebody that was sewing a heart valve for a living, you know, every day, or the most important R&D job or the biggest executive, we gave everybody the job to stay focused on patients. And if we're always doing good things for patients, it's going to be our North Star. It turned out to be very powerful for us. Early on, we borrowed a term from Bill Clinton. Remember back in the days when he said it's the economy, stupid? Well,
yeah.
I kept a sign on my desk, it's the patient, stupid. Eventually, some marketing people convinced me to make it a little bit more sophisticated, and now we end our creed of helping patients is our life's work and life is now. But it really has become the centerpiece. And we spend a lot of time reminding our employees of the importance of their work on patients. And we never have an employee meeting without sharing a video story, maybe a 5-6 minute vignette of some patient who had a great life, got sick, was completely debilitated, but had their life turned around. And those patients saying, thank you, doctor, thank you, company, for things that helped me get my life back together. And it's a powerful motivator. It's kind of the ultimate motivator.
Yeah, well, one of the products that's really changed the history of things enormously is your use of TAVRs and putting valves in percutaneously via the vascular system. That product has grown enormously. What's next?
Well,
what do you see about growth and innovation for over the next 5 years?
So we learned a lot. I mean, the idea, and especially, you know, you think about somebody like Dr. Cosgrove, was one of the preeminent heart surgeons really in the world. To think about the fact that we're actually replacing heart valves with a catheter without opening the chest and stopping the heart would have been mind-boggling to us not that long ago. And here we are. It happens routinely, you know, hundreds of times per day around the world by all kinds of clinicians. So it's really been reduced to practice, and it is remarkable. But, you know, once you gain the confidence to do that, you say, well, what else could I do with a catheter? What else could I come through the vasculature and take something that you would have had to open the chest and stop the heart to repair, call it the structures of the heart. And it's led to this whole field that we now call structural heart. What else could you do by catheter? And there's so much technology that's evolved that we believe that some of the things, so for example, Dr. Cosgrove was a specialist in repairing and taught the world really how to repair mitral valves. We think, even though that's enormously complicated, that there's going to be ways to do that for broad swaths of patients by using a catheter in the future, and we're pursuing it. We'll no doubt stub our toe and make some mistakes and not get it all right, but we're really optimistic that we can do that. And there are other valves in the heart. There's other structures in the heart, and ultimately, even one of the number one killers in the world, number one expense items as well, heart failure. Do you say, can I do something with a catheter to interrupt the heart failure cycle? And so those stimulate us and make us excited about what's ahead and what's possible.
So Mike, what we're seeing though is a major use of fluoroscopy in dealing with these patients and putting hearts in place or beginning to do something transvascularly. And I'm sure you're aware of the fact that this is increasing the risk of from the radiation, particularly in the cath lab for surgeons and cardiologists.
Yep, absolutely true. If you're just doing just putting a stent in, you would think there, hey, be somewhat limited exposure. But even those are moving more to radial access and even carotid access at times, which puts physicians in the field far more often. And when you think about the structural heart procedures that we're talking about, now these procedures can go a long time. So the cumulative exposure there is a real issue. Maybe not so much for the patient, but when you think about the physician that's there every day for hours per day, we have some docs that say, hey, I do 6 by 6, meaning I do 6 taps by 6 in the evening. So you think about that, that's an awful lot of exposure. And being able to keep cath lab personnel safe is a very important issue.
Well, you'll be glad to know that one of the products that InnovaHealth is working on is a company called Radiaction, and that is going to reduce the exposure for the people in the cath lab by about 95%. So exciting. Let's move over, if we could, to talk about COVID. We're really living in a whole new world now. How's this affected your team to start with?
Well, it was definitely an agility test to say all the things that we used to do in the past, try doing it during a global pandemic. So obviously there's a number of jobs that we can do where people immediately went to remote work, like much of the rest of the world. But there were other parts of Edwards where it simply couldn't be remote. So for example, our supply chain, our people that build the things that are critical, and we're a market leader, so people need our essential products. People came in and they worked in our manufacturing operations continuously through this. Often what we found is we could keep them pretty safe because when they were in working, they were in clean rooms, but getting them to and from was enormous hurdles with all kinds of structural issues. And then we also are a high service, high touch kind of company where we provide a lot of service to individual procedures, help procedures go well by having clinical experts, and we needed to find ways to make sure that those people got there to be able to help physicians and patients during this. And so it was a test and continues to be a test. If there's one thing that has been really tough through all this, it's been actually the impact on our patients. Because here you have patients, and knows better than Dr. Cosgrove, our patients have real mortality risk. Most of the patients that an Edwards treats, mortality risk might be 4% at 30 days or 12% at 90 days. And when you think about it in those terms, when we scare the heck out of those patients and scare them to stay home and they don't seek treatment, now they're going to have the risk of their underlying condition that maybe even compete with the risk of COVID. And so that's been a whole nother set of challenges.
Okay, so Mike, what's that done to your sales of valves and equipment?
So what happened is our company was zooming, doing fabulous. About the second week of March, it was like a light switch. Things fell precipitously as the economy stopped. And much of what happened was, Obviously there were hard hit places like New York or places in northern Italy, but across the US and across the world, there was this notion of there is a wave of COVID patients coming. You better prepare for the surge. So people stopped doing quote unquote elective procedures. They stopped doing everything. They emptied ICUs, all hands on deck. And as a result, they just stopped treating patients. And so, and Edwards wasn't alone in this. There was an abrupt halt. And that went on for a good, I'd say, 6 weeks. And then at that point, I'd say many hospital systems either saw the surge or didn't see the surge and said, you know what, we need to get back into some kind of a viable mode where we provide all the health care that's needed and treat the COVID patients. So we better get the procedures going again, both because the patients need it and also just for the viability of the hospitals and the systems. And so we started seeing things come back in May and come back in June in a fashion that was even faster than we imagined. It's not back yet, but it came back remarkably strong.
How far back from where you expect to be are you? What percentage you think you? We're about 90% back in the inpatient and about high 80s in the outpatient.
Yeah, I think if I were to put my finger in the wind, I would say that's pretty typical for what we're seeing across the globe. What we predicted this part of the way through July. We said we thought that the third quarter would essentially be flat to 2019. So it wouldn't be the growth that we typically expect, but at least it's back at 2019 level, and that we would actually have growth again in the fourth quarter. So
I'm happy.
Seeing things.
I'm happy for you. That's good. So what about the clinical trials? And I know you got a lot of clinical trials going on. Did that halt those?
In many cases, yes. Hospitals are just forced in most cases to just stop all the machinery that's associated with something like research. That was almost considered a luxury. We need to be prepared to treat our COVID patients. And so in several cases, we just outright halted trials. In other cases, it was more of a soft halt. We made sure we were communicating with all our physicians and with the FDA in this regard. But since that time, we've gone back, and clinicians are anxious to start doing research again. They've got research teams, research capabilities. So we're seeing, this start to return again. It's not back at 100%, but it's come back pretty strong. There's a lot of interest in going again. It's interesting, though, that once you stop a machine, getting the machine going again takes a little bit of time. It takes some weeks and sometimes months of effort to get that going. But we're watching the research come back.
Mike, the FDA has been under tremendous pressure and has shown that they're been a little more flexible than they have been in the past. What do you think that the effect on the FDA is going to be long-term in terms of getting things through in a more rapid fashion?
Yeah, I have to say I have been encouraged. When I think about all the years that I've been doing this, and Toby, you might think the same. We remember back when, there were pretty draconian actions on the part of the FDA, and they were protecting the public from all of us innovators. I think they look at their responsibility differently, and they say, we've got an obligation to the public, and especially during a moment like COVID-19, they felt the obligation. We need to be able to rush answers and solutions and innovation to patients. And so there was already momentum, but we felt even more. We feel like there's true sense of compassion that we need to get answers for people that need it sooner, and they're prepared to be more reasonable, more open than we've seen them historically. It's been impressive.
So, Mike, let's talk about the post-COVID world. And what do you think the long-term effects are going to be both on the MedTech world and the healthcare delivery system?
Yeah, it's a good question. We're going to change, aren't we? I guess it's a little difficult to predict, but I've got a few things in mind. One is, my personal belief is that we are all going to prioritize our health at a higher level than we had before COVID. And people are
I
going
hope
to care.
so.
At one time when we said, oh my God, do you realize that we might spend 20% of GDP in the US on health? That would have been horrifying. Maybe tomorrow they say, so what's wrong with that, right? I really do think people are going to prioritize health more than they have in the past. Obviously, this going, we've all learned to go remote and be virtual like we never would have imagined in the past. I can say, how many times did I spend time on a call like this back in January? Well, a little bit. Now it's my day, right? Like most of us. And I think that's going to have profound impact on the healthcare. There has been a movement to say, hey, can we encourage remote visits in healthcare? That got accelerated in a dramatic way. Now, I understand from lots of folks, and Toby, you can comment on what it was like at the clinic. During the depths of COVID-19, we saw what 50, 80% jump in virtual visits. And now that in-person visits are okay again, that's subsided. And depending on your generation, many people still would prefer a personal visit. But it makes you wonder whether we ever go back to where we were before, and whether we all develop confidence and skill to say, you know what, and we're going to do more remote visits than ever in the past. And by the way, it's not exactly hurt by the fact that CMS is now going to pay for some of those remote visits that they never paid for.
Very helpful.
Yeah.
Great.
What about the MedTech world? Do you think that MedTech world is going to change in terms of the things that they look to try and develop?
Yeah, it's interesting. Of course, some of the things that are, just in the media every day, if you think of personal protective equipment or maybe even diagnostics, those might have been sectors that we yawned about in the past. And now these are some of the most exciting, or ventilators, right? These became essential industries almost overnight. And so, of course, there's that aspect. But if you look across the spectrum, I think a few things are going to happen. You've got a question mark on, okay, how do we innovate tomorrow versus yesterday? And what does that take? And I'd be happy to comment on that a little bit. And then there's also, how do we interface with those in the system? As Toby's kind of an expert, if you look at most of the healthcare innovations, there's often been this beautiful collaboration between technical people, kind of engineers and scientists, from industry, with physicians. And that's always been the magic ingredient that stimulated innovation. Is that going to change? Is it possible for some of those things to be remote? You think about it, Toby, you go back to the early 80s. This guy was incredible. He would do surgery all day at the Cleveland Clinic, get on an airplane, fly to Southern California, spend a day with our engineer, creating the future of repairs for mitral valves, and then back on a plane in time to be up early the next morning and treating, patients. So incredible. Will that ever change? Can we do that virtually? Good question. I might be a little old-fashioned. There's something about the innovation process that I'm not so sure is simple to do remotely.
Okay, so let's talk about that, Mike. I mean,
Yeah.
You send a half workforce home. Are you going to bring them all back, and why?
So we are working on bringing them back. We're trying to walk this very careful balance of making sure that we're keeping people safe. And so we're fortunate to be on a big campus here in Irvine, California, where we can spread people out and have social distancing. We insist on masks, we do excessive cleaning, all those kind of things, and try and do meetings outdoors. And so we're at a point now where we've got about a third of the people back on any given day. And the reason we're motivated to try and bring people back in a safe way is we believe good things happen when you put smart people together with goals. And some of it you can't program. I call it casual collisions. You bump into somebody, you're having a conversation about one thing, it leads to another. Next thing you know, you're problem solving. You just connected dots that you wouldn't have connected. And it's hard to describe, but I believe if you're a real innovator, you're really trying to change the world, that those kind of stimulus and those kind of thing, kind of problem solving gets facilitated in person. And I know that's controversial. You've got some of the best tech companies in the world say, hey, if our employees don't come back to the end of 21, it's just fine. We're not thinking that way. We don't think our innovation can happen, like a software engineer sitting in a Starbucks. We think it's really helpful for them to be, to some extent, with other team members with diverse thinking, trying to solve problems. Yeah,
I totally agree with that. I think there's that casual bumping into somebody at the coffee cup with a coffee cup makes a big difference. Let's talk about one more thing about sourcing for you. You bring products from all over the world. You think sourcing is going to change for healthcare in the United States?
Sure, it will. I mean, if there's one thing that got battle tested right now, was all of our supply chains got battle tested in a big way. And so when borders closed or flights stopped or all that stuff that you guys know about, that put tremendous strain on supply chains. And so if you were trying to be efficient, you didn't necessarily have excess capacity. You didn't worry about resiliency. That's a whole nother dimension. And I'd say supply chains around the world are going to think about, okay, how do we diversify our suppliers? How do we make sure we have resiliency in our supply? And, should we be making something close to home and have regional capabilities? So I think this is going to evolve, and it's going to change the thinking of those of us across the MedTech universe. And I don't know, is that what you were getting at, Toby?
Absolutely. I think it will too. And I think probably the cows across the country are now in major trouble because of the pericardiums are in danger.
Yeah, well, you'll smile, Toby. What Toby was referring to is our tissue valves, and really the best heart valves in the world are made from tissue. And with the help of guys like Dr. Cosgrove, we learned that pericardial tissue was most durable. So this is the sac that goes around the heart, and it was readily available from cows that are slaughtered every day. Some of the thinnest cows are cows that eat grass, opposed to corn, as you might imagine, and those are in Australia. And so we saw a supply chain really disrupted when flights between Australia and the U.S. stopped, and we had to go to the Australian government to get them to reinstate some flights. So gives you just an example of what happens to a supply chain that was very global in the past.
Hmm. It's a very good segue, actually, Mike, because I have to say the stock market has been bullish on your stock for many, many years. It's been quite a performer for your investors, and obviously we applaud that. And as you take a step back from the day in and day out of dealing with quarterly results and how the stock is performing, is there anything that you could impart on kind of what has created such positive and durable investor sentiment?
Yeah, well, thanks. So, I mean, investors, they like results, but, in our world,
Right.
I think the way that you really deliver is to truly be an innovator and be willing to go out and be the ones that are going to change the world, even if it impacts your legacy great businesses. And so willingness to invest in the future, be a long-term investor and stay committed, right? Day in, day out, to take failure in stride and make adjustments, but to really have a commitment to innovating is so powerful. I mean, I'm a passionate believer that as good as healthcare is today, it could be so much better. And there's so much technology that's evolving at every moment. If we can apply that to problems that we're solving today, we can do a far better job than we ever have in the past. And it takes the courage to take some of that winning and invest it constantly back into trying new ways, coming up with bold ideas. And that you have to back up with big evidence, because the world's not going to change unless
Right.
you have the clinical and the economic evidence that says, no, it's better than the old way. But that takes long-term commitment. But when you do get that right, you get the investors really staying with you, because that's where the growth comes from. Right.
Right. I love it. I think that sounds absolutely right. Just turning a little bit to your work over many years at AdvaMed. Can you just describe your role and your history with AdvaMed? I know it's been an important factor in their effectiveness over a long period of time.
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, AdvaMed is the trade association the biggest one that represents medical technology companies, and really global, and it's all medical technology companies. And I've been a member of that for close to 20 years at this point, and ultimately became the chairman of AdvaMed at the end of the last decade. And I had the privilege of representing the industry as we went through the introduction of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, if you will. And so I had lots of experiences. And I used to think that I understood healthcare until you start getting involved at the highest level. And when you feel like, boy, I thought I knew it all, but now when I'm across the table from the people that are representing hospitals, and then somebody else is representing all the payers, the insurance companies, and somebody else that's involved in the labor union, and you go down the list of all the players in healthcare, you say, wow, this is more complicated than I thought. How do you get a system where we get it all right and everybody wins? It's humbling to do that. And not only were you trying to be a productive member of that broad ecosystem, but you were trying to get all the MedTech companies to have a common voice. And think about the difference across medical technology. If you're a diagnostic company, or if you're a sleep company compared to a cardiovascular company or a diabetes company, how do we get them to all have a common voice and have some common themes? So it was a development experience for me, and I feel like I've learned a lot. But we have a remarkable industry that really has come together, and we find ways to have a common voice. And we know that when we have a common voice, we get so much more done than when we're individuals as opposed to in a choir.
Yeah. Have there been any recent efforts in particular that you could cite on, that have been learnings about COVID, how the medical technology field and particularly AdvaMed have helped sort of get some of the smaller companies in the industry through this COVID period?
Sure. Actually, it's a great point. So, as COVID hit, we asked ourselves, okay, how do we make ourselves easy to work with? How do we respond to this challenge? How do we make sure that we do something positive as opposed to be on the sidelines? And three elements sort of floated up. One was, can we organize all the diagnostic companies so that government in general, and all those policymakers had a common place to go to say, what does the scorecard look like for diagnostics? What's coming? When's it going to come? What's the capabilities? And so that was one effort. There was a second effort that was around, how do we get patients back into the system? Because the system had pretty much shut down. And we said, how do we facilitate that? And then there was a third element that you brought up, Tim, about small companies. All of a sudden, small companies felt an incredible amount of pressure. There was a certain amount of big companies that pulled back and said, gee, maybe I'm not going to do any funding right now because I'm threatened or my balance sheet isn't so strong. And we said, okay, how do we help smaller companies really weather some of this storm? Because we know what incredible innovations come from small companies. And that group gets together, they share experiences. Here's how I'm dealing with it. Here's how I've gone to virtual mode. Here's how I'm trying to get through my clinical trial. And here's some tips in dealing with the guys that are potentially the ultimate buyers. Actually, these guys put it up, and here's the person to call, et cetera. And so those shared experiences, I think, have been meaningful for the small companies.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. It certainly played we've certainly been in the flow, as you can imagine, of companies as they've sought advice and capital during this period. There's no doubt about it. Toby, did you had perhaps another question or two, I think.
Yeah, so talk a little bit more about the culture of your organization, Mike. I find it a very unusual culture that is really willing to take the chances. And how do you keep that going? How do you teach people that? How do you maintain that culture? I find that was the most difficult thing to do, and I think that the fact that you've championed it has been the success of of your organization.
Well, thank you. And you know, we think about it every day, and we try and stay humble about it, because as soon as you think you've got it figured out, that's when you're potentially going in the wrong direction. But you know, there's a few elements. One is, as opposed to some other successful med tech companies, we've decided not to diversify. We say, you know what, there are so many unmet needs for these structural heart patients and the critical care patients that we serve. If we just stay focused on that group, we can do a lot of good for a long time. And that focus is an important element of our strategy. We say when it comes to innovation, you know, everyone says it, but really being serious about it, and don't just go for small innovations. Those are hard anyway. Do something important, do something big, go for a breakthrough that can actually change the way that medicine's practiced. And have the courage to do that, knowing that you have to back it up with evidence, knowing that there's high risk associated with that. Because you know, any kind of change in healthcare is a heavy lift, and you might as well do something important. And when you get it right, and the triple win is what we talk about, you know, in terms of getting it right, when you really can improve mortality, morbidity, when you really can lower costs in the system and improve the quality of life of patients, okay, now really done something, and do that in a big way. And the third part is, we like to do things and go first and be the leader. We're fortunate that just about everything we do around the world, we're the global leader. You know, that's easy to say, but frankly, it's not necessarily the best business strategy for everybody, because when you go second, you can learn from other people's mistakes and not make those yourself. When you're going first, you go through a lot of dark roads, and there aren't even roads yet, and you make a lot of mistakes. The good news is, though, you learn faster than almost anybody else because you're the one that's going first, and it still puts you in the room with other leaders, whether it's the thought leaders, the policy leaders, those are going to craft regulatory policy, or payers, and you get a chance to actually develop what this could look like in the long run.
You know, Mike, you know, a lot of people say that big companies can't innovate. You've gotten to be a big company now. Do you think you're still going to be able to innovate?
I absolutely do. Matter of fact, I take that as a personal challenge every single day and say, yeah, come on, you think we can't? Let's watch. But you know what? There's some elements, and I became a student of innovation a long time ago. And you said, what is the reason that small companies do so much innovating and big companies don't? And there's a whole bunch of really good reasons. Part of it is, inside big companies, we try and be efficient. And that means, hey, that team, they only need a third of a regulatory person, so I can get one regulatory person that takes care of 3 teams. If you're in a small startup and you've got 10 people, one of them is regulatory, and when they're taking a shower in the morning, the only thing they're thinking about is how do you make that happen. So we're willing to be inefficient inside Edwards and have dedicated teams that have nothing to do except focus on their problem. You know, I think there's other smaller things. So, for example, big companies do annual budgets. The innovation process doesn't operate that way, right? The innovation process is, hey, when you get something done, come back and we'll give you more money, right? And so, how do you implement that kind of a process inside a big company? So there's a number of examples, and just plain being able to tolerate failure. Inside big companies, in many cases, they just, you know, they don't relish that, right? And part of it is, when you reach high, you're going to be wrong a lot. And having a culture where it's okay for people to raise their hand and say, I was wrong, but I have an idea on how to fix it, and do that fast. those are the kind of elements that says if you get that right, you can innovate inside a big company.
Are you going to give the Failure of the Year award?
Yeah, I might be the awardee for most years, right?
Mike, you've been terrific to share this time with us. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike, and for your time, and Toby for your arranging all of this. As I said at the very beginning, so much of Edwards' strategy and focus aligns with our own goals at InnovaHealth Partners in focusing on the smaller companies, those middle market companies that you mentioned that have, that are looking for growth capital and have innovative and differentiated technologies, whether they be in the US or Europe or Israel. And so we really appreciate your perspective and insight here.
Well, thanks, Tim. I really appreciate it. And very best wishes to you and your company. And you got a heck of an advisor here in Dr. Toby Cosgrove, that's for sure.
Yeah, we totally agree with you. So thank you both. Thank you very much. It's been a particular pleasure for us to host Mike and today. And when we in the medical technology field talk about extraordinary success stories, of course, there are few that can equal Edwards' accomplishments with Mike at its helm for its entire life as a public company. Edwards' creation of multi-billion-dollar global markets in minimally invasive heart surgeries is legendary, of course. But so is the journey that got it there. The company's relentless focus on its goals, on going deep, not wide, its data-driven approach to creating clinical excellence in study after published study are all central to what drove TAVR and its successor technologies in structured heart to become the standard of care. So the unique culture that Mike described, the substantial investment it makes to support its research and development, the search for outstanding patient outcomes are all what it's about. And we at InnovaHealth Partners are delighted that, Mike, you joined us today to understand the Edwards story better, especially in the context of this pandemic environment we've all been enduring. It's clearly what drives our firm as we search for the right companies and technologies and the right management partners to work with to replicate the kind of success that Edwards and Mike have created. Tiffany, I'd like to ask you to take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. As mentioned earlier, a recording of this presentation will be available on our LinkedIn page and on the IH Interest section of our website. To access that curated information we share about the medtech industry, please visit innovahealthpartners.com/interests. We want to thank Mike Musallem once more for spending some time with us to discuss how healthcare, and in particular the medical technology industry, have been affected by COVID-19. As always, please feel free to reach out to us directly after this presentation if you have any questions. We will be hosting our next webinar at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, October 22nd, when Dr. Toby Cosgrove and Dr. Ariella Gollum will welcome Mark Bertolini, former CEO of Aetna, to get his perspective on the long-term implications of the pandemic. Thank you all for joining, and we look forward to being in close touch. Stay safe.